Snow should have buried everything by now, but when rescuers reached the slope of Koletsyakal, they found a tent still standing, half collapsed and sliced open from the inside. The fabric hung in jagged strips, as if the people inside had clawed their way out in blind panic. Their boots were neatly arranged, their jackets and gloves still inside. Nothing about the scene made sense. Tonight, we follow one of the most disturbing trails ever left on a mountainside. Welcome to Forgotten Signal. In the fresh snow leading away from the mutilated tent were footprints, bare, sock-covered, wandering into the darkness in a calm, deliberate line. Not running, not scrambling, just walking, into air cold enough to stop a heartbeat. There was no sign of an avalanche. No wild animal tracks. No intruder. Only the eerie silence of 9 experienced hikers stepping toward death with no logical reason to abandon shelter. Hours later, the bodies surfaced. Some nearly unclothed. Some crushed by an internal force so strong investigators compared it to a car collision, yet with no external wounds. And one hiker, missing her tongue, whatever terrified them that night moved without mercy, and without leaving any trace behind. Before terror claimed the slope of Koletsyakal, the journey had begun with discipline, confidence, and routine. The 9 students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute were not reckless adventurers chasing danger for thrill. They were seasoned hikers, hardened by snow, trained in winter survival, and united under a leader who planned every step with almost obsessive precision, Igor Dyatlov. Their mission was to reach the remote peak of Otorten, a mountain whose name in the Mansi language loosely translates to "do not go there." The warning was cultural rather than supernatural, but it carried weight. The region was unforgiving, scarred by brutal winds and temperatures that dipped below -30°C. Still, these hikers had conquered worse. They documented everything: photos of smiles, crude jokes about the cold, meticulous notes of their daily routines. Nothing suggested fear. Nothing hinted at doom. On January 27, 1959, they started their ascent. For days, they advanced through forests and ridgelines, building momentum despite the punishing weather. But by February 1, a brutal windstorm forced them off their planned path. Dense snow swallowed the trail. Instead of retreating to the forest for shelter, an option recorded in Dyatlov's notes, they made a perplexing decision: set up camp on an exposed mountainside where the wind cut like knives. The tent they pitched was secure but cramped, anchored into the snow at a slight incline. Inside, the hikers removed their boots, peeled off damp layers, and prepared for the night. Their stove wasn't assembled. Their supplies were organized. Everything felt controlled, safe, predictable. Nothing in that quiet moment gave even the slightest hint that within hours, panic would erupt, and no one inside that tent would live to see sunrise. The first signs that something was wrong never appeared in a dramatic burst. They crept in quietly, almost imperceptibly. Earlier entries in the hikers' journals mentioned unusual winds sweeping across the ridge, gusts so strong they bent the tree line, howling in a way the group jokingly described as the mountain screaming. They laughed it off, but the tone of their writing shifted, slightly, subtly, as if the environment was growing heavier around them. That night, conditions worsened. The wind became erratic, slamming into the tent with irregular bursts, then dropping into unnerving silence. Snow drifted against the canvas, creating pockets of pressure that made the fabric pulse as though something outside was pushing back. According to later reports, the hikers would have heard strange acoustics created by the terrain itself, low-frequency vibrations generated by the wind snaking through the surrounding valleys. Modern researchers suggest these infrasound waves can trigger disorientation, nausea, and an overwhelming sense of dread. But in 1959, the hikers would not have known this. Inside the tent, the group remained calm. Igor Dyatlov was known for strict control under pressure. Yet a detail found by investigators later hinted that something had disturbed them. The hikers had laid out their boots and gear with unusual haste, as if preparing for something unplanned. A knife was found positioned near the tent wall. Not with the cooking or climbing equipment. No one could say for certain what the hikers sensed in those early hours, whether it was the wind, an instinctive fear, or something moving in the storm outside. But whatever it was, the first warning had already arrived. And soon, it would escalate beyond anything the group could have prepared for. What happened next remains one of the most puzzling decisions in survival history. Sometime between 9 p.m. and the earliest hours of February 2nd, the hikers made a choice that investigators would scrutinize for decades. They cut open the tent from the inside and stepped out into a blizzard. They didn't use the entrance. They didn't reach for boots or jackets. They didn't take flashlights or weapons. They sliced their only shelter open, deliberately, in a straight, controlled motion, and walked into temperatures cold enough to crystallize skin in minutes. Why? Rescuers later reconstructed the scene with meticulous detail. The footprints leading away from the tent told a chilling story. The hikers did not bolt in panic. They moved at a normal walking pace. Some wore only socks. Some wore nothing on their feet at all. A few seemed to walk in pairs, as if communicating, but there was no sign of a chase, no chaotic scattering. It was as if something inside the tent terrified them more than the brutal winter outside. The tent's interior supported this unsettling theory. Diaries, ration bags, tools, everything was left neatly. The stove was still unassembled. A flashlight remained on top of the tent, later found switched off under a thin layer of snow. No sign of a struggle. No sign they were preparing to leave. Their escape was sudden but not frantic, voluntary but inexplicable. Forensic analysts described this moment as the hikers' point of no return. Once they stepped outside inadequately dressed, in the dead of night, on a mountain with no visibility, their fate was sealed. Every meter they walked into the darkness lowered their chances of survival to near zero. Whatever drove them out of that tent ensured none of them would come back. From the moment they stepped outside, the mountain swallowed them whole. The wind carved through the darkness like a living thing, bending the snow into violent spirals that erased the world beyond a few steps. The temperature hovered near -30 degrees Celsius. Any skin exposed for more than minutes risked freezing stiff. Yet the hikers pressed forward, leaving a trail of bare and socked footprints that rescuers would later track with disbelief. At first, they moved together, 9 silhouettes pushing into the storm, their outlines illuminated only by the faint reflection of starlight bouncing off the snow. The wind drowned every sound. Their breathing, already shallow from the cold, turned sharp and frantic as the air clawed at their lungs. Frost gathered instantly on their eyelashes. Their fingers numbed, their muscles stiffened. But still, they walked. Investigators believe their first destination was the tree line, nearly a mile downslope, an instinctive attempt to reach shelter. The forest promised 2 things the open slope could not: cover from the wind and materials for fire. And under normal circumstances, the group would have had no trouble reaching it. But these were not normal circumstances. The dark was absolute, the ground steep, the cold unforgiving. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, the group had splintered. Tracks showed some walking arm in arm, others drifting slightly apart. The cold was already taking its toll. Their thinking slowed. Their movements stiffened. In extreme hypothermia, the brain begins to misinterpret signals, creating confusion, disorientation, and a rising sense of panic. The hikers would have felt their strength draining in waves, their bodies betraying them piece by piece. Near the forest's edge, 2 of them, Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonishenko, collapsed beside a large cedar tree. What happened there was a brutal lesson in survival against a force no human body can withstand. Claw marks were later found on the bark, stretching several meters high, as if the men tried desperately to climb out of the cold or reach higher branches for firewood. Their clothing was torn by the struggle, their hands, blackened from frostbite. A small fire pit was found nearby, but it had burned only briefly, its embers faint, its warmth stolen instantly by the wind. Not far away, 3 more bodies, Dyatlov, Slobodin, and Kolmogorova, were discovered lying between the cedar and the tent, as if they had attempted the impossible, to crawl back uphill in the storm. Their positions showed determination, an almost superhuman effort to return to shelter, but their bodies could not endure the cold. One had a fractured skull. Another showed signs of blunt force trauma with no external wound, injuries consistent with extreme impact or crushing pressure, not a simple fall. Yet the most disturbing discoveries lay deeper in the forest. 4 hikers, Zolotaryov, Dubinina, Thibault-Brignol, and Kolevatov, were found in a ravine, partially buried beneath snow. Their injuries defied explanation. 2 suffered massive chest fractures. 1 had a shattered skull. And Ludmila Dubinina was missing her tongue, eyes, and part of her lips. Pathologists noted there were no signs of predatory attack and no external trauma matching the violence of their internal injuries. The pressure required to break their ribs would have been similar to a car collision, far beyond what a human fall could produce in deep snow. The deeper investigators looked, the more the mountain resisted offering answers. The hikers had cut, walked, collapsed, and died with a pattern that suggested both logic and madness, a blend of survival instinct and absolute terror. Their deaths were not uniform, not random, not clean. This was chaos with intention, and whatever sparked it had moved through the group like an invisible force, pushing them farther into the dark, one by one, stripping them of warmth, sense, and ultimately life. By the time the group splintered into their final positions, the mountain had already claimed control over their bodies. Hypothermia does not arrive like a sudden blow. It creeps in, silently shutting down systems in precise, cruel sequence. First the fingers, then the toes, then the mind. And when the mind begins to fail, the world twists into something unrecognizable. For some, the crisis came in the form of overwhelming exhaustion. Slobodin, found mid-slope, showed signs of repeated attempts to stand. His footprints circled, staggered, tightened, evidence that he tried to keep moving as the cold confused his sense of balance. He fell multiple times. Each fall left him weaker. His skull bore a fracture, but not one deep enough to kill him instantly. It was the cold that finished him, smothering his final breaths in silence. For others, the crisis arrived violently. Down in the ravine, the 4 final victims suffered injuries investigators struggled to categorize. Thibaut Brignol's skull was crushed by a force so intense it split bone inward without damaging the skin. Zolotaryov and Dubinina had ribs broken in symmetrical patterns, as if compressed by sudden, immense pressure. These were not injuries caused by stumbling in snow. They resembled the aftermath of a high-velocity impact, yet there were no signs of a fall from height. And then there was Dubinina, her eyes gone, her tongue missing, her lips torn, but there was no evidence of animal scavenging, no claw marks, no tearing consistent with a predator. The soft tissue had been removed in a way pathologists called unusual, exposed to water flow or decomposition, but the timeline didn't match typical patterns. Her death, like the others, resisted neat explanation. Meanwhile, the cedar tree told its own desperate story. Doroshenko and Krivonischenko had clawed at the bark with such desperation that pieces of their skin were embedded in the wood. They had fought the cold until their bodies no longer obeyed commands, collapsing into positions that suggested they were still trying to rise even in their final moments. The crisis peak wasn't a single event, it unfolded across the slope, the forest, and the ravine simultaneously. 9 hikers, all trained, all disciplined, all experienced, succumbed in different ways. But all within the same night, under circumstances no investigation has ever fully resolved. Something drove them into that storm. Something fractured bodies without breaking skin. Something left them scattered across the mountain like remnants of a force no one could see. When investigators reconstructed the final moments of each hiker, the picture that emerged was fragmented, tragic, and deeply unsettling. 9 separate endings shaped by the same invisible terror. Near the cedar, Doroshenko's final moments were spent locked in a hopeless fight against the cold. Witness marks on the tree showed he had tried to climb, perhaps searching for shelter, perhaps for warmth, perhaps simply trying to get above the storm for one last breath of air. His hands were raw, his fingers frozen mid-motion, as if he died still reaching upward. Krivonischenko, beside him, had torn pieces of his own clothing and attempted to keep the fire alive. The embers reveal he fought until the last flicker. Farther upslope, Dyatlov, Kalmogorova, and Slobodin attempted the impossible, returning to the tent. Their bodies were found in positions that suggested movement even after collapse. Dyatlov's arms were extended, his posture angled uphill, as though dragging himself toward safety he could no longer see. They died facing the direction of the only shelter they had left. In the ravine, the final 4 died together. Their injuries were catastrophic, but their positions told a quieter story. Zolotaryov was found with his arms crossed over his chest, as if bracing against pain. Kolevatov remained closer to the group, possibly attempting to help the others. Dubinina, even in death, seemed curled inward, a posture of protection, not violence. None of them died instantly, none of them died peacefully, each fought in a different way, shaped by the same freezing darkness that closed in around them. And when the storm finally took the last heartbeat on that mountain, the world fell silent again, leaving only footprints, broken bodies, and the unanswered question of what truly happened that night. It took search teams weeks to find the bodies. The hikers had missed their expected return date by days, prompting relatives to plead for help. At first, the authorities responded slowly, delays common in remote Soviet territories, but once the scale of the disappearance became clear, a full search operation began. Students, teachers, soldiers, and local Mansi hunters joined the hunt, combing the mountainside in harsh winds and waist-deep snow. The first discovery was the tent, partially buried, collapsed, silent. Rescuers immediately sensed something was wrong. The tent had been cut from the inside, an unmistakable sign that those inside fled suddenly. Their boots and coats were still neatly arranged. Nothing stolen, nothing broken, just abandoned. Following the line of footprints, the search team reached the cedar tree. That's where they found the first 2 bodies in the snow, half-dressed, positioned near a makeshift fire pit filled with charred branches. A few meters away, pieces of torn clothing were scattered, likely stripped from the dead in a desperate attempt to keep someone else warm, a known phenomenon in hypothermia cases. Days later, 3 more bodies appeared between the cedar and the tent, spaced out as if they had collapsed one by one while trying to climb back up. Snow covered their tracks, giving no clear answer to whether they were helping each other or crawling alone. But the ravine held the darkest discovery. It took nearly 2 more months before rescuers located the final 4 hikers beneath meters of hardened snow. Their bodies lay in a stream bed, partially buried, showing injuries unlike anything else found at the site. Forensic teams documented crushed chests, a shattered skull, and missing facial tissue. The cause of these injuries has been debated ever since. Despite exhaustive searches, no evidence of an attack, an avalanche, or human interference was found. No footprints except those of the hikers. No signs of weapons. No tracks from animals or intruders. The mountain offered up the bodies, but none of the answers. When investigators began piecing together the evidence, they quickly realized the Dyatlov Pass case resisted any single, clean explanation. Every theory answered one question, only to break under the weight of another. What emerged instead was a landscape of overlapping possibilities, each pointing toward a different type of terror. One of the earliest proposals was hypothermia-driven madness, specifically paradoxical undressing. It explained why some of the hikers were found with little clothing, but it didn't explain the crushed ribs, the shattered skull, or why trained mountaineers cut open their own tent rather than using the entrance. Hypothermia clouds judgment, but it doesn't generate bone-breaking force. Another theory blamed a snow slab avalanche, triggered by the steep campsite. While possible, the slope angle was lower than typical avalanche zones, and the footprints showed the hikers walked calmly rather than running for their lives. Moreover, the tent wasn't buried deeply, something inconsistent with a full slab collapse. The most controversial theory was military involvement. Reports from villagers in the area described strange glowing orbs in the sky around the time the hikers died. Soviet archives from the era confirm missile tests in the region, and traces of radiation found on the hikers' clothing fed speculation. But these elements remain circumstantial. No conclusive record connects weapons testing to the group's deaths. Others pointed to infrasound, rare wind patterns capable of inducing panic, nausea, and intense dread. This could explain why the hikers fled the tent. But it offered no answers for the violent chest fractures. Some researchers suggest the ravine injuries could have come from the snow itself, heavy, compacted layers collapsing over the group. Yet forensic examiners compared the force required to a car accident, raising doubts about whether snow alone could deliver such impact. In the end, every theory solves part of the puzzle. None solve all of it, which leaves us with a chilling truth. Whatever unfolded on that mountainside combined fear, force, and chaos in a way nature alone rarely produces. In the decades since the 9 hikers died, the Dyatlov Pass has remained silent, unchanged, untouched, as if the mountain itself remembers. Every piece of evidence answers something, yet opens something darker. Their footprints have long faded, their tent buried by snow, but the questions they left behind still echo across the frozen slope. Maybe the real mystery isn't what killed them, but what made 9 experienced hikers choose the darkness over the safety of their own shelter. On Kholat Syakhl, some answers freeze, others never thaw.